NuVoodoo Live.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of our series on podcasting. Today's topic is podcast topics, subject matter that tests well with the core demographic that listens to podcasts a little or a lot. And I'm joined with our head of research and analysis, Lee Jacobs, again to dive into that topic. Before we go there, I just want to kind of telegraph what we're going to do. We're going to actually show you the results of 2 different studies today, one of which is one we've been talking about here, which is a more recently completed study. And then one we did a few months ago that's more purely targeted at podcast listeners that allows us to do a slightly deeper dive. Lee, you'll explain the methodology. I'd start out by saying that a little review from the slide from our more recent data set that, again, my premise here is that one of the issues we're going to see as we look at podcast topics and what tests where and how much people are into this versus maybe wanting something better if it were to come along is that we're largely seeing the growth of podcasting in one particular cell that's been true for a while, right? Millennial men. It's the only place where we saw year-over-year growth in terms of overall use. So maybe remind us of the methodology of this study, and when we get to it, the study that we're going to refer from a few months ago.
Sure. Nationwide here, over 5,000 14 to 54s. We stopped at age 54, so not all of Gen Z is within this study, but most of it. I think Gen Z goes up to 57 or so these days. Stopped at age 54 here. So you see that within this sample, asked if to compare their listening to podcasts year over year, only men and millennials say they're listening more in the aggregate. Overall, we saw 30% saying they're listening more against 29 less, but men 26 to 33 say more, 23 to 35 say more. There's significant momentum within that demographic, which I would posit is kind of the epicenter of podcasting, being the place where the technology has been easy to deal with for the longest, the population that's most likely to do the extra thing to get their podcast into their ears, and an interest in spoken word programming, an interest in things that they can listen to other than music.
That's right, because this was not purely targeting podcast topic subject matter, as we're about to learn. It's also, I think we delved into talk show topic subject matter as well. Yeah.
Right. It was a really wide-ranging study, in fact. This one, this chart comes from an older study from the latter half of 2022, the last few months. And we started out in orange here is the universe that we began with, because this was a deep dive into podcasting alone. And so it goes all the way up to 57 last year to encompass all of Gen X. We had to stop at 14 on the younger end, couldn't get all of Gen Z to get below 14. I've got to get parental permission to do interviews, so we leave it at 14. And then in the gold color are those who qualified through. We started out with over 5,000 nationwide and ended up with just a little short of 1,700 nationwide who say they listen to podcasts at least an hour a week. But you'll notice the different shape demographically of those who listen to podcasts at least an hour a week. 36% of this sample of weekly podcast listeners turn out to be millennial men.
Yeah. And so Lee's theory is that this is the group of technology early adopters. They've used podcast back when podcasting was an iPod kind of only.
You had to download the
right. iTunes had to sync. It was pretty complicated. And so my men are typically the technological early adopters. And so I see that. But I also see now whether this is just a self-fulfilling prophecy at that the millennial men, because this is the audience for them, it's very likely that this is probably the plurality of the podcast producers that are serving the topic niches. But and now we're going to go back to, I know we're kind of playing ping pong here, but we're going to go back to our more recent study and now look at the scores. But I would just say, keep in mind what you're dealing with, whichever study we're looking at, it's millennial men that are populating most of the ratings that you're seeing here.
Okay, sure. And here, the 2 columns are on the left, the podcast listeners. Those are people who are listening to podcasts at least an hour a week. But then next to them, the podcast heavies. And those are the people who describe themselves as listening to podcasts at least 10 hours a week. And they are human sponges. I mean, they're interested in all sorts of things. They are the people who can always find another 30 minutes or another 50 minutes to listen to another podcast. And they're interested in everything here. The smallest number, and these were 31 different topics that we inquired about. And it was a wide-ranging sample and a lot of different question areas trying to accommodate the interests of a lot of our clients, some of whom are in the broadcast radio space and many of whom are within the podcasting space, and still others that I'll leave off for the moment. But we wanted to do double duty with this particular question group. So you'll see that among the podcast heavies, a little bit less interest in pop culture in this, but massive interest in all sorts of things, places to travel, news, family values, the economy, comedy. Overall, against podcast listeners, music, which is tricky as a podcast subject because you get into the licensing issues if you
That's a
use
complicated
any
one. Yeah.
music to try to illustrate your points in a discussion.
I'd argue too that most of what we're seeing, the hits are the hits: comedy, true crime, travel and vacations, staying healthy. Or I mean, we might be describing them slightly differently, but the hits are the hits here. But at the bottom of the stack, this is still the more recent study, again, multimedia study that has podcast fans as part of a broader spectrum. Here we do see some skews, some dichotomous readings between podcast regulars and heavies, mostly in the area of politics.
Sure. And interestingly, podcasts where you live is a big interest. Local community leaders talking about important issues has a much stronger interest among podcast heavies than the overall podcasting audience. And I'll, as sidebar, mention that, radio stations, our media partners, do that exact thing every week as part of their community outreach that they run, typically buried sometime early Sunday mornings, but they have local community leaders talking about important issues. And that turns out to be a pretty potentially in-demand podcast that if they had the community leader being interviewed, promote that to their base, to their constituents, then that's an opportunity to promote a station and develop yet another vertical of listening. And at the bottom of this, I thought it was fascinating that politics, 63% interest among the podcast heavies as opposed to 41% overall. And even lower are politics from a conservative perspective, 40 and 58, or a liberal perspective, a point lower than that at 39 or 56. The idea that it's straight down the middle and you as the listener, the person who gets to decide how you feel about it, not how the host feels about it going in, turns out to be an extra added chip.
Yeah, I mean, you've created the roadmap for radio stations that have most of their employees doing sanctuple duty, no extra time to create a new initiative. But here's one kind of screaming at you: you have to do that public affairs show on Sunday morning as part of FCC compliance. Here's an opportunity to do something that people are actually interested in, repurpose it as a podcast, and sell some sponsorship dollars. Okay. Let's fast forward, or should I say rewind, to our more podcast-centric study, where we're going to share with you the same data, though we do describe the subject matter a little bit. But this is squarely at a universe of people that we would describe as podcast regulars.
Right. Here we were thinking not so much topics, but topic areas. We were thinking about established types of podcasts, true crime, comedy, self-help, managing money, pop culture, productivity, etc. The lowest testing of this group was scripted drama, shows up at 37%, which that's 3 in 8 podcast listeners. I would say that's still, truthfully, a massive number. And if you had a great scripted dramatic podcast with names that I as a listener know, or actors that I care about, or Aaron Sorkin wrote this scripted dramatic podcast. You could absolutely develop a market for any of these.
With close to 2.5 million podcasts available in the iTunes store and something like 40,000 new episodes uploaded every month at least, I would be looking toward the bottom of this list, because even a 37% passion score given probably the lack of relative competition here compared to true crime or comedy or self-help, it looks to me like there's maybe more of a there. I think you're right. There would need to be some star talent, though.
Right. You'd have to have some reason that I, as a listener, go, oh, I should check that out. Why is it that I want to know?
All right. So the elephant in the room for me is, again, whether it's that the plurality or to majority of podcast audience are millennial men, or whether that just happens to be the epicenter of people producing podcasts. And so the interests are skewing in the direction of that demographic. Here we see what we refer to as a settling score. And we've used this in media for decades. This is where we ask people, for example, fans of a radio station morning show, like one of those shock jock shows, how well they tolerate the entertainment value. And if something better came along, how quickly or easily would they switch? And here, these are ostensibly settling scores for not specific podcasts, but topic areas, right? And they're telling us, for the most part, that there's really not a lot of there's not a lot of passion for the current choices that are out there.
Well, there's certainly some passion,
yeah,
but there are a whole lot of podcast listeners who, want a scripted dramatic show, but there isn't one that's really ringing the bell for them, that they're completely satisfied with. And I didn't get stuck with this overlay. I didn't produce separate numbers for it, but because my takeaway was, look at the tremendous portion of any of these topic areas that isn't really completely filled by existing offerings. Or maybe it's filled by existing offerings, but there's the gap between, sure, it's a great show, but nobody knows about it. It's a matter then of getting the word out.
And I think you're very nice to say that you didn't prepare those slides. I, in fact, didn't prepare those slides. And that's because I wanted to leave something back. We try to keep these little mini broadcasts to 10 minutes to 15 minutes, but we can do a deep dive, right? And Lee, you're available to do a deep dive into demographics,
sure,
into generations, into genders.
Country.
Yep. So if you're an aspiring podcast producer looking to perhaps identify a hole, whether it's a nationwide hole across a vertical, or whether it's a regional hole where you think there's an opportunity to establish a beachhead, Lee can help you. And I, or anybody on the marketing team, can help you if you're a media buyer or somebody who's interested in kind of figuring out how to optimize what collection of podcast categories might be optimal for your particular brand. You can reach out to me, Mike at NuVoodoo.com, and you are?
Lee, Leigh, at NuVoodoo.com.
And thanks to all of you for watching. We'll see you again on the next NuVoodoo Live.
As of December 2022, there were nearly 2.4 million podcast titles and almost 60 million total episodes hosted by Apple Podcasts. The average podcast, however, gets only 27 listeners per episode. For anyone trying to monetize, that's like a tree falling in the woods that nobody hears. But NuVoodoo helps podcasters cut through the jungle with research and marketing. We help find the right listeners and grow the audience fast. Learn more about podcast discovery. Contact Tell Me More at NuVoodoo.com.